Are you okay? So, Clark talked a little bit about my program of research, but I just want to reemphasize, I largely study race and racial identity development because I want to understand the experiences of students of color, mostly African American students, in education, more so from a lifespan perspective. My interest really is in the area of adolescence. That's just where my passion is. But it's really hard sometimes to get into schools to study adolescence. As you can see now with what's going on in schools, it's really hard to get in schools. But I'm also open to just understanding how race plays out in education. And I oftentimes use a critical race theory lens to view the experiences of African American students. I also have an interest in a passion for research methods. I consider myself to be applied research methodologist. I really enjoy writing about research methods and teaching research methods because I think it's really important for us to be able to explain not only what we do, but how we do it. So I really do like talking about teaching scholars about the work that I do, but how I actually did it. So I've written books on, qualitative methods and mixed methods research. So that's one big area for me. And I also, area I don't necessarily do as much work on, but I'm starting to do a little bit more on is emotions in education, particularly how emotions interact with race, or how when you're engaging in racial situations, how essential and how important emotions are. Because whenever there is a racial incident going on, you better believe that their emotions or how they evolve, there's definitely some negative emotions going on. And so I think it's important to look at emotions when we're talking about issues of race, because they are very central to the conversation. So those are the largely speaking of my three big areas of research, and kind of really describes my program of research thus far. And so I do want to talk to you a little bit about my study and what I'm looking at, I'm going to talk about today. So the purpose is to better understand how African American students experience racial microaggressions within the college context, and to better understand how emotions associated with those experiences are associated with racial microaggressions. As I just mentioned, when you have some type of racial experience, emotions are going to be involved. And then also want to look at how students cope with those emotions and cope with experiencing racial microaggressions, because it's not just you just experience those racial microaggressions. There is how do you deal with it more long term? That's something I also want to look at as well. And a larger goal of this study is to expand the exploration of race focus and race reimage constructs in ed psych research. And what I mean by race focus is like work that actually focuses on, that looks at that centers race in its work, but also reconceptualize race, reconceptualize traditional constructs to look at race in a more sociocultural perspective. And that was the actual purpose, the goal of the article that I talked about, that I published in Educational Psychologist under the editorship of Clark's work. And so it's really important for our field as psych to focus more on looking at race as a construct. And this work that I'm looking at right now is, as an attempt to actually do that, to actually look at, racial microaggression as a race-focused construct, but also kind of race reimaging kind of emotions and coping work to focus more of looking at it from a racialized lens. So that's kind of a secondary purpose of this particular study. So before I kind of get into kind of what I found and what I'm kind of grappling with right now in terms of trying to analyze, is understanding what do I mean by racial microaggressions. And these are kind of your brief everyday kind of messages that are very denigrating, have a derogatory message for people of color. They're kind of subtle snubs, dismissive looks and gestures. And what's interesting about racial microaggressions, they're usually comments or messages that you often, they're easy to be dismissed. They're kind of things that you're hearing, you actually second guess yourself. It's like, did they say this, or is that, can I interpret it this way? There usually are things that, a lot of times they're so subtle that you have to second guess, was that really something racial or racist, something somebody may have said. And according to Sue et al., there are 3 forms of racial microaggressions: micro assaults, micro insults, and micro invalidations. Micro assaults are generally the kinds that we all know to be, kind of definitely kind of racial statements. Those are the things like like racist symbols or racial slurs, like a swastika, a noose. I mean, those are things that are very obvious that, for instance, they're definitely intent that people are wanting to insult you. They're wanting to do something racial, racist. So whenever the N word, that's a micro assault. But most forms of microaggressions aren't as blatant as those micro assaults. They tend to be, like I said, more subtle. You're not quite sure what's going on. And those are the micro insults and micro invalidations. And a micro insult is, it denigrates a person because of their racial or cultural membership, while a micro invalidation questions or minimizes a person's cultural or racial experience. I'm gonna give you a couple of examples of that. For micro insult, for instance, a description of intelligence. And that is like, for instance, you have an African-American kid that's in a gifted classroom, and you have a student saying, "Oh, I didn't know you were going to be in this class," or "I didn't know you got into this class," or "How did you get into this class?" These are very subtle questions that are questioning, or statements that are questioning the intellect of these kids, particularly because they're Black, and asking how is it that they belong. Because of course, Black kids don't belong in the gifted program or the AP class. So that's description of intelligence. Or assumption of criminal status. Like if a Black student, if a Black person walks into an elevator, and all of a sudden all the people clutch their purses, or they walk out the elevator because of course they're assuming that this Black person is going to rob them or try to assault them in some kind of way. Assumption of criminal status. Or what we have seen on college campuses, where the Black students get carded in terms of, we need to see your campus ID, because they just assume that these students don't belong. Assumption of criminal status. That's a micro insult. Example of a micro invalidation, for instance, alien and own land. A lot of Asian American students experience this a lot. They may be asked, like, "Where are you from?" And they're like, "Oh, I'm from New Jersey." No, where are you from? Because they're assuming they're not American born, or they're from some foreign country. So alien and own land. Denial of individual racism. A lot of times you'll hear people of color talk about how they're trying to explain to their white friends, like, "Oh, I experienced this racial event." And then their friend continues to talk about or explain to them why that wasn't a racial experience, or why that wasn't racism. So denial of individual racism. And so there are a lot of different ways in which people can experience racial microaggressions through micro insults or micro invalidations. Now, what's interesting about racial microaggressions is that it's not the individual experience, and not just this one time, that makes it difficult. It's the idea that that you keep on experiencing these things. We can experience numerous micro insults and invalidations like each and every day, and it's the cumulative effect of these microaggressions that makes things difficult for people of color, and particularly African Americans. And so that's when understanding emotions and emotion regulation and coping comes into play. Understanding emotion regulation is important for exactly when the microaggressions actually occur, because that's kind of more immediate, and coping becomes more important, kind of more long-term. Like, what do you do? Because you're constantly being bombarded with these racial microaggressions, and that's when it becomes something that people need to engage in more long-term. But ultimately, experiencing these racial microaggressions will impact the way that you feel and the emotions that you experience. And so when we talk about emotions, we're just talking about the kind of these complex physiological state that involve a subjective experience, physiological and behavioral expressive response, And, most of the time when you're experiencing racial microaggressions, there are going to be some negative emotions or non pleasant emotions associated with those. We're talking about like anger, sadness, frustration. Um, you know, most of the time happen with that because it's, like you're in the moment, you're experiencing like, this happened, this person said this to me. And then you also get the negative emotion of, I can't believe this happened again. But these racial situations can cause these negative emotions, but it also cause you to react in a variety of ways. And so emotion regulation becomes really important. Emotion regulation attempts to have you figure out how emotions are experienced, when they're experienced, and how they're experienced, and how they're expressed. And so it's really important for people as they're experiencing these racialized emotions to think about, well, how do I actually express these emotions, of what actually should happen, what should occur. Because as I mentioned, if you have this very racial situation going on, emotion regulation becomes of extremely important, because things can go south really quickly when race happens. I mean, just look at all the things that have been going on recently that have involved race, and you see those tensions get high and those emotions get high. Emotion regulation becomes really important to figure out, like, how do people kind of control or understand the emotions they're experiencing, and then figure out, how do I then express and control my emotions that are occurring. And so emotion regulation becomes really key, particularly when when a situation is triggering a particular emotion, particularly when particularly when racial microaggressions are triggering a particular emotional response. But for long-term experiencing of racial microaggressions, we have to consider coping. How do people actually cope with the experiencing of these racial microaggressions and the stress that is associated with it? So there's a variety of ways in which African Americans tend to cope. There's collective coping, which is more so how they experience aspects in a group. And then there's self-protective coping, which is kind of ways in which they engage into more adaptive coping, which are more positive ways in which you engage in activities to kind of protect themselves, like meditating, exercising, journaling, that type of thing. Then there's resistance coping, which is a way in which you actually take control of the situation by addressing what happened. So if someone, you know, engages in a racial microaggression against you, then you call that someone out, you let them know what they did. That's more resistance coping. Then there are a lot more maladaptive coping strategies that people use: drinking, maybe smoking, overeating, avoidance of situations, or even withdrawal. But I will tell you, like, the maladaptive coping, as a caveat there, particularly for African Americans, that sometimes avoidance of withdrawal from a situation, particularly when it is highly, is a very racist situation where they experience a lot of racial microaggressions, may actually be a good thing for African Americans, because you're removing yourself from a situation that is really negative. And so, in the coping literature, they will say, avoiding situations or removing yourself from a situation is kind of a negative way of kind of coping, but actually may be a way of protecting, self-protection. So and I think there's more work that needs to be done, particularly when it comes to kind of coping with racism, how that actually might be, less of a maladaptive strategy and more of a self-protective strategy, particularly for when dealing with racism. And then Malor has kind of particularly some approaches that he sees that for coping with racism, that, at first you have to protect the South and do things that, are self-protective, and things to make sure that you're okay. And then doing things to maintain self-control as we think about experiencing racial microaggressions, like, we talked about the emotions, and that you have to make sure you engage in emotion regulation. but, also make sure you maintain that self-control. Like your first instinct may be, let's say if you're experiencing racial microaggressions on a job, your first instinct may be, well, okay, I just want to curse this person out. But you can't, because you do that, you might lose your job. So you have to maintain that self-control. And to figure out what's the best way to handle this situation, and maybe engage in some other forms of coping. But they also feel that one of the best ways to approach coping with racism is to confront the racism, which is also similar to what some of the other literature calls resistance coping. And so what the researchers was saying that one of the best ways to cope, at least with coping with racism, is to engage in resistance coping, confronting the racism. So eventually you have to address calling the people out. You have to confront it. You have to tell people what they're doing is wrong. And so that's some part of it. But so eventually coping is dealing with those physiological and behavioral processes caused by those racial emotions. So you have to figure out how the best way to deal with those racial emotions. And so for my current study, I am thinking about what Derek Bell talks about. Derek Bell, the founder of critical race theory, talks about how racism is an integral, permanent, and indestructible component of this society. He talked about how racism is permanent. Racism is just kind of everywhere, and it's just intertwined and we just everywhere in all the different components of society. And so to best understand experiencing racial microaggressions, we need to use a framework that really centers race and racial experiences. And critical race theory is one of those frameworks. It's not the only one. It's definitely one that I think kind of speaks to understanding those experiences. And so racial microaggressions are in essence a manifestation of the permanence of racism. So when I say critical race theory, there are a lot of different things, and you probably all heard that term in the media. There's a lot saying about what critical race theory is and what it isn't. But I'm going to talk about two aspects of critical race theory today. Critical race theory focuses on race, racism, and power in order to challenge the system of white supremacy. That's the two of the major tenets I'm going to talk about is racial realism, or centrality of racism, which looks at the permanence of racism and views racism as a normal, ordinary, and pervasive component of society. And then intersectionality, which examines the intersection of race and gender and the multiplicative nature of race and gender identity. And it really says that, singular analyses of just race or gender are sufficient, particularly when you're looking at the experiences of Black women. It really does require looking at the intersection of their race and their gender, because that's where their experiences lie. So those are the two tenets that I focus on for this particular study. And the guiding study, I shared some of the readings I shared. One was on, I don't know if you all got a chance to look at it, but one of the readings I shared was on critical race mixed methodology. And so, what I'm talking to you today is drawing from a larger mixed methods study. And so it kind of pulls from this larger critical race mixed methodology kind of framework. And so what I mean by critical race mixed methodology is that I'm combining traditional mixed methodology with critical race theory. And which focuses on integrating CRT with mixed methods. And so you do so through all the processes of the study. So with the research questions, the data collection, analyses, everything really intertwines CRT in the mixed methods. And in critical race mixed methodology, the research centers on race, it uses CRT, and the goal is challenging power structures to help create change. It's about focusing on race, power dynamics, challenging system inequity, and trying to make things better for the people that you're focusing on. And for me, it's for African-American students. So as I mentioned, I'm just, focusing, it's part of a mixed method study, but I'm going to only focus on the qualitative component here. And we're studying African-American students experiencing racial microaggressions and some PWIs. And these are mostly PWIs from throughout the United States, mainly in the Southeast. So we did use a variety of universities in the Southeastern United States. And so there are 15 participants, at least from this perspective, from what I'm putting forward for today. But there are 11 women and 4 men. There are full-time students enrolled in STEM programs, education or psychology. We had undergraduates, like there were 2 seniors that were almost really about to graduate that semester. And graduate students, 3 masters and 10 doctoral. And this representation, 11 women, 4 men, are pretty close in terms of percentage-wise, in terms of representation of Black men and women in terms of graduate programming in some of these schools in the U.S. So it's pretty representative. We use nested sampling, which is where the participants actually participated in the quantitative component of the study, and then we actually drew the qualitative, the interviews from the participants from the qualitative actually came from that quantitative component. So everybody in the qualitative actually participated in the quantitative part of the study. And so we used semi-structured interviews. We gave them a demographic questionnaire, which was really helpful. And it just basically asked some background information and kind of where they grew up and what kind of schools they went to, how the kind of activities are engaged in the college context, because we want to kind of understand kind of what they were doing on campus. We're actually looking at some aspects of belonging as well. So we want to kind of see how they felt that they belong on the college campus. So we actually asked a lot of questions about belonging, some different things that they actually did and engaged in. And so we actually analyze our raw data using open coding, and our codes and concepts were connected using axial coding. And then we related that to larger themes and made connections to the research literature. And we used a code book development for credibility, multiple coders, integrated reliability, probing, thick, rich descriptions. And we used deduce for coding and data retrieval, which I highly recommend if you're using multiple team members and you're in multiple places. I really like deduce because it's web-based and people can kind of log in whenever and they want to. And I just find it really helpful to use it. Just kind of a FYI if you're looking for something to analyze data with. I just find it deduce to be really helpful in working with teams with people in different places. So for our 4 people, we ended up, so today I'm actually going to be talking the stories of 4 different students. We had Jamie, a master's student in elementary education, Candace, a master's student in school administration, Erica, a doctoral student in math education, and Christopher, a doctoral student in ag education. I'm going to read a little bit from Jamie's story. So Jamie was the master's student in elementary education. She said, which brings me to when I moved into the big towers, which here at Capital University, they have towers, and that's where all the rich people stay. I met a boy who had just transferred from Eastern University. And he said that his roommate's last name was the same as mine. And he asked me, and this is a white boy who's rooming with another white boy. And he asked me, he was like, oh no, he said, do you think any of your family members are hanging in his family tree? And then I stabbed him with a fork. And I almost got kicked out of school because I wouldn't tell them what he said to me to make me stab him with a fork. And the interviewer said, why didn't you? Because I was embarrassed and I didn't think people would believe me. And then she talked about how she was just angry and she was just so angry about how everything happened. So Jamie, she experienced a lot of negative emotions. Like, she was angry, she was embarrassed. I mean, she had to deal with, this situation. And of course, she had difficulty in emotion regulation. She stabbed somebody with a fork. But, it's important if you did more of a traditional, analysis, you would just say, yeah, she just kind of can't, regulate her emotions. But, you have to look at the racial context. She's at a school where, possibly the intersection of race and socioeconomic status, because she said this is where all the rich kids live. And, they basically talked to her about, do you think any family members are hanging in his family tree? But, they're making light of lynching, that, the historical context of Black people being lynched. And so we have to look at this racial context and just the emotional labor that Black people have to endure all the time of having to experience, these racial microaggressions and have to deal with having to interact with people all the time who use this kind of language, and the racial trauma that she was experiencing, had to experience. And so when you take in consideration that racial context and that centrality of racism that she was experiencing, so you're going to look at her experiencing the negative emotions a little differently. You're going to look at her difficulty in regulating her emotions are a little difficulty. And you're going to understand why she stabbed him with that fork. Maybe that wasn't the best choice for her, but at the time, in her emotions and her rage, that was kind of her best outcome. The next story is a little different, but this is one that really kind of had my whole team, my research team, to kind of step back and really think about the impact of the kind of work that we're doing, and how sometimes we're going in to study race, but it's not just really about race sometimes. Candace was a master's student in school administration. She said, City University, being an African-American student in City, I felt like everyone expected me to be like an exotic dancer. I didn't feel respected. I felt like no one thought I belonged in classes, and they thought you would be better off out of school just entertaining people. Men were more aggressive in City. I even had a professor sexually assault me during office hours. That kind of made me hesitant to seek out help because the majority of my professors were white males, and I had a white male professor who sexually assaulted me. It made a very hostile environment. Even working, I did research in microbiology, and I had supervisors ask me, do you have a father? As if I don't have a father. There would be another kind of negative comments like, oh, this celebrity is pretty for a Black lady. So it just made it very hostile. I noticed that in my labs, I was always left out of group activities. But I did have an advisor. I guess while I was going through the program, I was sexually assaulted by a faculty member. So it made it difficult for me to get help that I needed. She's just like, you can't get up with the rest of the students. You just can't keep up. That's kind of made me feel upset, even after I graduated, because it's like, wow, I'm surprised because I thought you wouldn't graduate. I mean, this story, was just intersectionality. It's about race and gender. It's about her gendered racial microaggressions. It's about, all what she experienced about being a Black woman. In these situations, it's about, these comments, they said things that they would never have said to a Black male, particularly about, her feeling like she had to be an exotic dancer. Right? Do you have a father? Oh, this person's pretty for a Black lady. These are things that just would not have said to a Black male. And then her experiences were, she was suffering from this racial trauma and this sexual trauma. And it was compounded trauma. I mean, she mentioned several times that she was sexually assaulted, and then by a white professor. And so, so her experience that, in graduate school was just clouded by this sexual trauma, and then this racial trauma that just was just compounded. And she just did not have the support that she needed. And when we had this, it's my doctoral student was my graduate student, he was actually a master's student, but African-American male, and he actually did this interview, and he was just so overwhelmed doing the interview and coming back and talking to me about, what happened and talking about it. And so I totally revamped the way I'm going to approach just doing any of my interviews. Of course, when we, have my IRB, it says on there, oh, if you have any discomfort, you can go and reach out to these, to counseling center. But now we just automatically hand all our participants, say, hey, before we start, we just want to let you know the counseling center is available, and we give them the counseling center's information, because we realize, as people start talking about their experiences with race, it can be traumatic. I think now, in the time which we're dealing with, these more high profile racial cases like Ahmaud Arbery and all the other cases that we've been having more recently, these different traumas, they're impacting people in different ways. And, we never would, I just didn't expect, someone to talk about their sexual trauma in combination with their racial trauma. So, her story really has impacted me as a researcher in terms of what I should do and how I should actually, handle that as I'm working with my students and training my students. But her story is really important because we have to think about it. People don't experience things in a singular fashion. They are often intersectional. And the same goes with race. And, in this case, sexual trauma, but it's race, and it could be SES, it could be sexuality, it could be a lot of different aspects, but intersectionality is really important. And so I do want to talk really briefly about, like coping. And so how do these students cope with kind of what's going on? Jamie, the student that talked about stabbing somebody with a fork, she said, so writing really helps me organize my thoughts and really check my emotions, because I would get angry when people invalidated me, especially because of race. It's like I have not even said anything, and you have already had to have these thoughts about me. I also knew that with writing, people would think what they want to think about me. But if I'm confident in myself, you have no choice but to be confident in me. So I had to put up my shield, and people threw things at me, and I wrote about them. And I showed up every day with the same confidence because, like I said, I'm confident in me. You have no choice but to be confident in me. So she engaged in a lot of self-protective coping, a lot of racial affirmations, really, self-positive talk. Erica was a doctoral student in mathematics education. She said, is there a word for how I feel? I don't know. Defeated a little bit, like there's nothing I can do. Really, it is what it is. Yeah, I feel slightly defeated. And so, very maladaptive coping, unlike like Jamie, who's engaged in these positive racial affirmation, she has this very negative self-talk, just, really get into almost a depressive state. And then there's Candace, who I just talked about, who was sexually assaulted. She explained, at first, I didn't handle them very well. I fell deep into depression and gained almost 100 pounds. After I learned how to open up about what's happening in my life, that's when I better handled the situation that came up. And so, again, maladaptive coping, overeating, becoming depressed, gaining 100 pounds, that's not good for our health. But that is definitely a common way that people actually cope. Then as Christopher, a doctoral student in ag education, he said, my physical well-being, this experience I've had my times where I may just get on an eating binge. I'm not big or anything, but I gain weight because you're trying to just cope with things out here because of the environment. You're so much involved in schoolwork, and then you just think about just things. You're just trying to stay alive. When I mean staying alive, just straight staying alive. And so once again, eating, he talks about how he's not overweight, but he still turns to, these external things like food to actually help him with his coping. But the seriousness that he says, you're just trying to stay alive. That just kind of shows how hard it is to cope, and how to deal with these racial microaggressions and this racial stress that they're experiencing. It shows how it is impacting these students. And so it's important to see how the centrality of racism influences students. And that, and there are some impact because of intersecting identities of race and gender. And, in these students, in these racial microaggressions, it lists a variety of negative emotions. And oftentimes our students don't have they lack a lot of emotion regulation strategies they need to deal with these. And so, we need to really think about better ways to look at emotion regulation and racial microaggressions. And so these negative emotions are often exacerbated when they constantly experience racial microaggressions and have to constantly engage in coping. So you have these negative emotions they experience, you have racial microaggressions and have to cope. It's just like this vicious cycle. And so once you keep on experiencing that, these racial microaggressions lead to this racial trauma, which leads to this psychosocial stress responses, and race-related stress. And so we know that race-related stress can cause all kind of health issues, a lot of cardiovascular issues, a lot of just, depression. We talk about overeating, and that could just cause all kind of issues. And race-related stress is a pressing public health issue in our country. And those are really serious things that we need to be addressing. So there are a lot of policy implications. I know we're running a little short on time, so I'm gonna just go over a couple of ones I think are really important. We need to start having candid conversations about race and racism in education at all levels. And I'm really concerned about this right now with all the anti-CRT, anti-race, anti-history, bills we have going on all over the country. Is that, it's gonna be really hard for us to teach kids about race and racism and the impacts of it, and how to cope with discrimination, because we can't have these conversations with our kids in school because we're starting to outlaw these things. They can't even read about them in books because we're outlawing the books. We're taking them off the shelf. So, but these are things we really need to start teaching our kids. But so I'm not sure how we're going to do it when we're making it legal in schools. And we also need to address the experiences of racial microaggression as an issue of public health. As I mentioned, there are cardiovascular issues, diabetes, obesity, premature babies, high infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates, mental health issues. It's just it's an issue. And we need to address structural racism that perpetuates racial microaggressions in schools. We're talking about structural racism in schools, in policies that produce racial disparities. There's a lot. AP gifted placement, discipline practices, special ed placement, the lack of culturally relevant curricula, lack of teachers of color, lack of administrators of color. There's a lot of different structural issues that we can address. And so for me, like some of the work that I particularly want to do, I actually want to start working with kind of, want us to maybe start looking at expanding beyond kind of self-reports, looking at kind of impact of race and racism for students, and maybe looking at some biomarkers such as cortisol or some other aspects of some kind of neurological kind of things. Going to USC, there is a little bit more infrastructure there. I might be able to kind of go into some neuroscience kind of work. So I'm really excited about that potential. I would like to help work with educating teachers on the impact of racial issues, but now that all these CRT laws, it's going to be really hard to work with, in-service teachers. We can work with pre-service teachers, but what happens when they get into the classroom? That's what I'm really concerned about. And then I think it's really important to teach parents, to really help parents with some of this work, because I think the parents are the key to really helping them to better understand racial microaggressions, helping their kids to understand their emotions and emotional regulation, but helping them to help their kids to develop better coping skills, and teaching the kids those coping skills as well. But the earlier we can teach the kids about their emotions, emotional regulation, and coping, the better. But once again, I'm really nervous, particularly I know here in the South, they're coming out with anti-CRT, anti-emotion, social emotional learning bills. They're really outlining all these things that we know will be really good for kids and their future development. So those are the things I think would like to kind of work on. And I'm actually getting the opportunity to do some work on that, because I'm doing some work with some people at Penn State and actually engaging in some things in terms of policy and helping to maybe talk to some policymakers about the importance of critical race theory and looking at using critical race theory in education research. But I'm not sure how far that's going to go, but that actually is in process. So that's all I have for today. But so I'm going to stop there. If you have any questions. Okay, so I'll talk a little too much, but
you're on mute, Danielle.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. I think you were right on time, and just what you shared, I think it was so necessary. I think so many of us were having visceral reactions to what you were sharing. So please, the audience, put your comments and appreciations and questions in the chat. Just to start, I see we have a question from Joyce Leslie. Would you like to share your question, or I can read it out for you? Okay, I'll go ahead and read it. So the question is, have you looked at how Black public school students suffer with both micro and macroaggressions in their history and their present?
Hi, Joyce. That's a good question. Unfortunately, I have not had a lot of opportunity to work with a lot of K-12 students here in I'm in North Carolina. In the South, it's really difficult to get into K-12 schools, particularly, well, it's hard to get in K-12 schools, but it's really hard to get into schools and to study racial issues, because this is even before all of this started happening, because there is a concern of principals were always really, in school systems were always really concerned that you would come in and discover something, and then it would go to the media and there'd be some kind of some history that's, oh, so and such school has this racial issue going on. And so there was always this really big issue. I did have a project with a school system, and we wanted to study student science identity and their relationship with their teachers. And so we had some science, self-efficacy kind of stuff, and some things about relationship with their teachers, and some gender identity, and some racial identities things. And so we met with the school system IRB. They had their own IRB because that's how big the school system is, and then they talked to us about all the scales we want to use, and then they literally told us, "Oh, yeah, but we don't really want you to ask these questions about gender or race." And so they basically said we can actually do the study if we actually got rid of the gender and the race questions. And they told us they didn't like the negatively worded questions that we had on the instruments, that they want us, can you word these in a positive way? Because we didn't want to get the students, we want to always present things to students in a positive way. And I'm like, but you're messing up the psychometrics of the scale. But but my point is that the schools around here, they really don't want to present, and we could not ask the students. We could ask the students what their gender or their race was, but it had to be optional. I mean, they were just really hesitant about asking anything about race or gender. I mean, even just ask a student, what is your race? What is your gender? Became this really controversial thing. So I do think it's really important to look at the experiences of K-12 students, and I would love to do so. But it's a really hard environment to do that here in the South. And so I mentioned earlier, since I'm moving to USC, so I'm hoping in California I might have a better opportunity to do so, because I think schools are a little bit more progressive out there, and hopefully I find some opportunities to do that.
I'm going to jump in. This has been fascinating, in lots of different ways, and thinking about relationships between what you do and what I'm currently doing in one of my projects with younger students. And I'm wondering, in terms of the ways that the coping mechanisms, were there instances or examples in which the system or something about the system was actually beneficial in terms of helping them cope? Because it seems like a lot of the coping was done individually, first of all, and outside of the system, meaning the system was in no way seen or had any support structures. And I'm wondering, were there instances of something where, okay, if there was more of this in the system, people could leverage that to help?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. A lot of students talk about how, like, at the universities, they had, let's say, for instance, Black cultural centers, that type of thing. But they mentioned that a lot of those centers tend to be more geared toward undergraduate students. And so a lot of those support structures, really, they have them on campuses, but they really are there for undergrads. And the graduate students there, their experiences are just different. And they just don't feel as comfortable going. They're just kind of fish out of water to go to some of those functions and things, because their needs are just totally different. And so I think there's some structure on place on college campuses, but they're not designed for the doctoral students, who sometimes may be a traditional doctoral student who's going full-time, but sometimes they may be a non-traditional student going part-time and working. So it's really hard to kind of have those structural things in place for them.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense.
Dan, you want to ask your question?
Sure, thanks. Thank you for this talk. This is really, really fascinating and insightful. And I have a couple questions. One is, I know there have been some people in the field kind of critiquing microaggressions and whether that kind of captures like what's happening. And I'm kind of curious just on your thoughts about using it and whether you feel it's capturing the students in your study. And then the other question I have is, I guess, more of a curiosity, because we have a project looking at race and gender in mathematics, higher ed. And So we asked them to talk about discouraging events, and most of the events they submitted were actually with instructors. And I'm kind of curious to hear if most of the events that you captured were with peers or with instructors, or was kind of a mix. And yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked the question about microaggressions. I've never liked the name microaggression. I'm glad you brought that because there's nothing really micro about it. I mean, it's one of those death of a thousand cuts type thing. It's just, and I think when Chester Pierce kind of came up with that name, I think it was just kind of it's micro because it's just like a one small instance, but I think collectively the impact is huge, and I think it's just a misnomer, and I think I don't know if I just haven't found a kind of better name or a better construct I want to use to kind of captures what I'm looking for. But you're right, I don't really like that name. I think people don't like the name of it. And so like, what are your experiences with race? Just kind of clunkier to just kind of say these racial microaggressions. But I know that there's been some really I forgot what journal. I have to look into it, but there's been some really recent interesting pieces on racial microaggressions and how they want to expand it, kind of talking about instead of focusing on what the aggressor is doing, we should be focusing more those who are experiencing the racial microaggression. And so there are some new frameworks that are different from the Sue's model of racial microaggressions that you may, I don't know if you looked at some of those, but they are really interesting to kind of maybe look into. But they just kind of came out like in 2021. I mean, they're like really, really new. So I don't know if they got really gained traction in the field yet. But I just thought that just kind of a different perspective. I haven't had time to really sit back and think about it and digest it and see kind of how it worked because I'm kind of invested at this point in the Sue model. But I do want to kind of sit back and think about how that works. But I know your second question was about did they experience more so? I think it was kind of a combination of experiences with instructors and peers, because I think when you start asking them about in general their experiences on the college context, it just includes everything. They start thinking about when I'm walking on campus, and then when I sit into this classroom, and then when I engage with my peers. I mean, it just becomes everything. And unfortunately, a lot of Black students are experiencing racial microaggressions, and they're getting it from all these different angles. And I think that's what makes it so much more difficult. We could just say they only experience it in the classroom. Then I think we could say, okay, well, how do we just address, instructors and kind of how they engage with students? But they're experiencing it in the classroom. They're experiencing it with, their peers. They just experience it just walking across campus. I mean, I went to the University of Georgia as a graduate student. I still remember some of the horrible things that I experienced just walking on campus. And sometimes it wasn't even from other students. It was just people who just happened to be on UGA's campus, who just happened to just say, because they weren't students because they just, they didn't look old enough to be students. And so, I mean, it's just kind of just the culture of being in that climate makes things difficult. So yeah, it's just kind of a combination. So it's kind of like, how do we address the climate of these campuses? Or whatever that your context is.
Before I ask, I'm checking to make sure there's no students who wanted to jump in, so I don't see anybody. So let me ask about socio-emotional learning. So that I think it has been criticized from a direction that I'm wondering what you might be sympathetic to, and I'm wondering what you're thinking, that a lot of times programs in socio-emotional learning want to regulate out just and righteous responses to injustices, and to kind of let's say make the outrage over justice a little quieter or not so angry. So I wonder what you think about, maybe what you see as a good way of promoting socio-emotional learning, and whether the approaches that are commonly advocated now need to be, adjusted or changed to reflect, to sort of accommodate the kinds of issues you're seeing in your research?
Yeah, I think I think part of it, I think it's kind of a I think there's a very varied way in which it's kind of being enacted in our schools. And so I don't even know when we say social emotional learning in schools, are we even using the same definition anymore? And it just kind of reminds me of the CRT debate. Like I know what CRT is, but then how everybody's using CRT is just all over the place. And so I kind of have I understand the social emotional learning, but then I'm not sure how people are enacting it in schools and to making, the backlash, my understanding is like you're really helping students to understand themselves and to kind of engage with others and to, to understand emotions and, and their sense of identity and to engage in these variety of ways of learning and how that impacts their learning. But then that's very different than some of the other things that you were just talking about. So I think we just need to kind of get back to the roots of kind of what social emotional learning is supposed to be about, and maybe kind of, I don't want to say leave the political stuff out, because I think it really is important for us to address race and those issues. But I think if we address some of the core aspects of social emotional learning, the other aspects will come, because as you start thinking about, if you start teaching students in a culturally relevant way, those things are naturally merged. You don't have to force a lot of things. And I think that's where the issues come in. And Clark, I think you hit the nail on the head, because in down South, I don't know if you realize it, they are equating critical race theory with social emotional learning. Like they're saying they're doing anti-CRT stuff, and they're saying, oh, another way of, another way people doing CRT in school is social emotional learning. And I have been trying to figure out, wreck my brain. It's like, how is they saying social emotional learning is CRT? I was never understanding that, but to kind of hear you saying that's one way they're kind of engaging in doing social emotional learning work in schools is very different than the way I've been seeing them do social emotional learning work in schools, at least here. So I think we just need to kind of go back to, I don't want to say go back to the basics in terms of how we look at social emotional learning, and and then focus on really understanding the learner, and then incorporating, like I said, more of a culturally relevant way of learning, and then try to figure out how do we best merge that. I think if you look at the work of Revati Kumar, some of their work, I think that's a really good way for us to kind of embrace and merge some of that work, instead of kind of, I think what happens when people kind of try to say, we're going to do race and force race, I think that's where people get upset, and it I hate to say it gets all messed up. I think, you have to really think this out. Whenever we kind of stray away from the traditional way of schooling, that's when people get all upset about it. And so I'm in support of social emotional learning. I think those are things that we do need to teach kids in school, and we do need to engage in more culturally relevant learning, but we do need to figure out a way to more merge the two. And like I said, I do like the work by Revati Kumar. I can't remember who she has on her article with her on. I want to say, is it Akame Zusho on that article? It may not be, but I know it's Revati. But they're talking about that approach, and I think it's really important for us to think about, how do we merge those, more carefully think about how you merge those two. And I think that was the problem. They just didn't think about how do you really merge, talking about those things. And now we're seeing the backlash, in politics. And we didn't necessarily need to, but then they would have exploited it anyway. Even if we had merged it in a nice way, they would have exploited it anyway. But that's kind of where we are, just kind of, politics of it all.
Yeah, the political response is proof of the theory, actually.
Right. Exactly. Definitely in the case of CRT. Yeah, this is exactly what Derek Bell said would have happened. It's exactly happening. Yeah. Yeah. Any other quick questions? I think we're close to time. Almost over.
Yeah, I think we're out of time, but thank you so much for your talk. This was so important, so necessary. I think you really struck a chord with a lot of us. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for the invitation.
So much.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Have a great day.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye,
All
everyone.
right. Bye.